You felt it before. You walk into a room, you haven't said a word yet, and someone's already looking at you like you owe them money. You've been nothing but decent, polite, professional, maybe even genuinely warm, and it doesn't matter. Some people meet you with a coldness you can't explain, a distance that has no obvious cause attached to it. And the question that keeps you up later isn't, "What did I do?" It's worse than that. It's, "What if it's just something about me?" Here's what's actually true, and it's rarely what people expect. Most of the time, that hostility was never really about you at all. It's the visible symptom of something happening entirely inside the other person, a private war you got pulled into as a bystander. Over the next 29 minutes, I'm going to walk through 9 specific reasons someone might quietly resent you, reasons that have almost nothing to do with your actual character. Number 5 is the one most people never see coming, because it hides behind something that looks a lot like friendliness. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll never read a stranger's cold shoulder the same way again. Understanding this isn't just an academic exercise. It changes how you carry yourself through your own life, how much weight you give to a coworker's clipped tone, a friend's sudden distance, a family member's unexplained edge. So let's get into it. 1. Envy and jealousy. Of all 9 reasons on this list, this is the one people recognize fastest once it's named out loud, and the one they're slowest to admit applies to someone hating them specifically, because admitting that means admitting you're doing well enough at something to be worth envying. I watched this play out directly a few years ago with 2 guys who'd started in the same entry-level role at the same company, more or less the same background, similar starting salaries. One of them got promoted 18 months in. The other didn't, not because he was incompetent, just because promotions in most companies are partly timing, partly visibility, partly luck of which manager happens to notice you at the right moment. What followed wasn't congratulations. It was a slow, deniable campaign. Comments in meetings that undercut the promoted guy's ideas just slightly. A joke at his expense that was almost funny enough to not need defending. A habit of leaving him out of lunch plans that used to include him automatically. None of it was dramatic enough to point to directly. All of it added up to something the promoted guy could feel, but couldn't quite prove. What was actually happening had nothing to do with anything the promoted employee had done wrong. His success had become an uncomfortable mirror for his colleague, a daily, walking reminder of a gap between where his colleague was and where he'd hoped to be by now. Rather than using that gap as motivation, his colleague found it easier to shrink the mirror instead of doing the work to close the distance. This is worth understanding at the mechanism level, because it explains why reasoning with someone's envy rarely works. Envy isn't really an assessment of you. It's a report on someone else's relationship with their own life, their sense that they're behind, that opportunity passed them by, that fairness has somehow failed to deliver them what they deserved. You just happen to be standing in the specific spot where that feeling gets triggered. Marcus Aurelius kept coming back, in his private notes, to a version of one central instruction. Stop spending energy on things outside your control. Someone else's envy is about as far outside your control as anything gets. You didn't create it by succeeding, and you can't dissolve it by apologizing for succeeding either. What you can control is whether you let it change how you show up. I've watched people quietly downplay their own wins for years, specifically to avoid triggering a coworker's resentment, softening an accomplishment, deflecting a compliment, pretending a promotion wasn't a big deal. And all that actually accomplishes is training yourself to shrink. The colleague's envy doesn't go away because you got smaller. It just loses a convenient target for a while, until the next thing you do well becomes the new mirror. 2. Misunderstandings and ineffective communication. Most people assume real hostility needs a real reason, some actual offense, something you said or did that was genuinely out of line. Often it's much smaller than that, and much more avoidable. A single message, read at the wrong moment, in the wrong tone, that quietly calcifies into a permanent impression. Think about how much of modern communication happens over text, Slack, email, channels that strip out tone entirely and leave the reader to fill in the blank themselves. A manager sends a 2-line reply to a proposal. Fine, go ahead. Read one way, that's approval. Read another way, especially if the person receiving it is already a little insecure about the proposal. It reads as dismissive, maybe even irritated. The manager moves on immediately, having felt nothing but neutral. The employee spends the rest of the week convinced their manager thinks the idea was weak and starts quietly pulling back from bringing new ideas at all. Nobody did anything wrong in any deliberate sense. A forward message did all the damage on its own, filtered through an anxious reading that felt, to the reader, completely justified in the moment. I've been on both sides of this. I once went nearly a month assuming a close friend was upset with me because of how a text exchange had gone. Short replies, a missing exclamation point where I expected one, a joke that didn't get the usual response. I built an entire narrative around 4 sentences. When we finally talked in person, it turned out they'd just been slammed at work that specific week and hadn't been reading anything carefully at all. The distance I'd felt was completely real to me and completely imaginary in terms of its actual cause. The core problem is a structural one. There's almost always a gap between what someone means and what lands, and without active effort on both ends, asking instead of assuming, clarifying instead of interpreting silently, that gap fills itself in with whatever story the listener already had a reason to believe. Once that story sets, it starts acting like fact. The relationship gets quietly rebuilt around a misunderstanding nobody ever tested out loud. The fix isn't complicated, but it does require deliberately fighting your own instinct to assume the worst interpretation and move on. Before you decide someone's tone meant something, ask. Before you decide their silence meant rejection, check. It feels almost too simple to matter, and it's exactly the step most people skip, because checking requires admitting you might have gotten the story wrong in the first place, and most people would rather stay certain than be corrected. 3. Differences in fundamental values and beliefs. Every person walks around with an internal blueprint of how life is supposed to work, built from family, culture, religion, the specific neighborhood they grew up in, the mistakes their parents made and overcorrected for. Most of the time, that blueprint stays invisible, quietly shaping decisions in the background. It becomes visible, and occasionally hostile, the moment someone nearby makes a choice that doesn't match it. I think about a woman I knew who left a stable corporate job in her early 30s to become a full-time potter, genuinely happy, financially fine, by all accounts thriving in a life she'd deliberately chosen. Several people in her extended family treated the decision less like a personal choice and more like a personal insult. Not because her choice affected them in any material way, it didn't, but because her willingness to walk away from the exact kind of stability they'd built their entire self-worth around felt, to them, like an implicit judgment of the path they'd taken instead. If she could be happy without the corporate ladder, what did that say about the decades they'd spent climbing it? That's the actual mechanism at work in most values-based hostility. It's rarely really about the specific choice, the career, the relationship, the belief. It's about what that choice implies for the person judging it. Someone else's different path becomes uncomfortable specifically when it exposes a fork in the road the observer didn't take and can't fully stop wondering about. Epictetus made a point that applies directly here. Each of us is shaped by our own upbringing and circumstances, and expecting everyone to arrive at identical conclusions from radically different starting points was never realistic to begin with. The practical version of that isn't passive tolerance, where you simply avoid the topic. It's active curiosity, actually asking someone why they see it the way they do, rather than filing the disagreement under wrong the moment it surfaces. Most values conflicts that turn into real hostility never actually involved a real conversation. They involve two people independently deciding what the other one must be thinking and reacting to that imagined version instead of the real one. 4. The influence of rumors and gossip. Of everything on this list, this is the one that costs people the most for having done the least, because it doesn't require you to have made any mistake at all, just to exist within range of someone willing to talk. I knew someone early in her career who got quietly frozen out of a project team for almost 6 months before she found out why. A rumor started by someone she barely knew, claiming she'd taken credit for another team's work at a previous job. It wasn't true. It also didn't need to be true to do damage. It just needed to be plausible enough and repeated by enough people that it hardened into something people treated as background fact rather than an unverified claim. By the time she heard the rumor directly and could actually address it, most of the people who'd absorbed it had already adjusted how they treated her, without ever mentioning why. What makes rumor-driven hostility uniquely difficult is that you're not actually fighting a real disagreement. You're fighting a version of yourself that exists only in other people's heads, built out of secondhand information you never got to shape or correct in real time. You can't out-argue something you were never told was being said. The only genuinely durable defense against this is unglamorous and slow consistency over time between what you say and what you do, visible to enough people that a false story eventually collides with lived experience and loses. It doesn't work instantly, and it doesn't work by chasing down every rumor to argue with it directly. That usually just adds fuel. It works by continuing to act like yourself long enough that the gap between the story and the reality becomes obvious to anyone paying real attention. Reputation repair is rarely a single conversation. It's 100 small, unremarkable moments of just being who you actually are in front of enough people for long enough. 5. Personal insecurities and projection. This is the one that hides best, because it rarely looks like hostility at first. It can look like teasing that's slightly too pointed, or a compliment with a strange edge underneath it, or friendliness that somehow always finds a way to include a small dig. I watched a friend go through a version of this with someone who, on paper, seemed like an ally, supportive in group settings, quick to offer praise in front of others. One-on-one, though, the same person had a habit of bringing up my friend's occasional failures, always framed as just looking out for you, always landing at a moment that seemed almost engineered to take the shine off a recent success. It took a long time to name what was happening, because the behavior never crossed a clear enough line to point to directly. Eventually, it became clear. This person was quietly, privately dissatisfied with their own stalled progress, and my friend's visible momentum had become an unbearable comparison point they couldn't stop making internally, even while performing support externally. Seneca's insight on this holds up remarkably well as a diagnostic tool. People who feel insecure tend to unconsciously project those feelings outward, often onto the specific person who embodies whatever quality they feel they're lacking. It's not usually a conscious strategy. It's closer to a pressure valve. Directing discomfort outward is simply easier, in the moment, than sitting with the discomfort of your own perceived shortfall. The practical tell worth watching for. Does someone's warmth toward you consistently include a small qualifier, a backhanded compliment, A habit of bringing up your setbacks specifically when you're doing well? That pattern, repeated enough times, is usually not really about you. It's a person working through their own comparison to you in real time, in the only way they've figured out how, by quietly, repeatedly cutting you down to a size that feels less threatening to stand next to. 6. Lack of empathy and understanding. Some hostility isn't really personal at all. It's the byproduct of someone who's never developed the basic muscle required to imagine what another person's experience might actually feel like from the inside. Picture a manager who reads a team member's request for a deadline extension purely as laziness, without any consideration of what might actually be happening in that person's life. A sick parent, a personal crisis, simple overload from being handed 3 other projects simultaneously. The manager doesn't hate the employee in any dramatic sense. They've simply never built the habit of pausing to ask, what might explain this, other than the least generous interpretation? And defaulting to the least generous interpretation is exactly what a lack of empathy looks like in ordinary daily practice. Not cruelty, just a kind of imaginative laziness that reads as coldness from the outside. This tends to concentrate in people who are, in one way or another, deeply focused on themselves, not necessarily in a dramatic, obviously self-obsessed way, but in the quieter sense of rarely turning their attention outward long enough to actually register what someone else might be going through. Their disregard doesn't usually announce itself as hostility. It shows up as dismissiveness, a flatness in how they treat other people's struggles or wins, an indifference that, from the receiving end, feels remarkably similar to being disliked even when it's really just being unseen. The useful reframe here is one worth actually practicing rather than just hearing. When someone's coldness seems to have no clear cause, consider that it might not be a verdict about you at all. It might be the outer edge of a limitation the other person carries into every relationship they have, with you simply being the current recipient of it. 7. Competition or rivalry. Healthy competition is one of the more reliable engines of growth available to anyone. A coworker's strong quarter pushing you to sharpen your own approach, a sibling's success making you want to close a gap through your own effort. Something shifts, though, the moment competition stops being about your own growth and starts being entirely about the other person's decline. I saw this clearly in an amateur sports league. Nothing high stakes. Just weekend games among friends, where 2 players who'd once genuinely enjoyed competing against each other slowly turned it into something closer to a grudge. One of them started making comments designed less to motivate himself and more to unsettle the other before games. It wasn't really about winning the match anymore. It had become about proving something to himself that had nothing to do with the game at all. Some private sense of falling behind in other parts of his life that had nothing to do with a weekend league, channeled entirely into needing his friend to lose. Marcus Aurelius's warning on this tracks closely with what actually happens once rivalry curdles past a healthy point. It starts pulling people toward behavior they wouldn't otherwise defend, undercutting, sabotage, quiet campaigns to diminish someone rather than efforts to improve yourself. The tell that a competitive relationship has crossed this line is simple to check for. Does your energy go into your own improvement, or has it redirected almost entirely into wanting to see the other person specifically fail? The first is fuel. The second is corrosion, and it corrodes the person carrying it at least as much as it affects the target. 8. The influence of social expectations. Some hostility isn't really about you as an individual at all. It's about what your specific choice represents to a group that's built its identity around a different one. Consider someone raised in a tight-knit community with clear, unspoken expectations about career, marriage, faith, the general shape a respectable life is supposed to take. and who then chooses something meaningfully different, a career path the family considers frivolous, a partner outside the community, a decision to remain single well past the age everyone assumed they'd be settled down. The reaction from some corners of that community rarely stays neutral. It often turns cold, sometimes openly disapproving, occasionally cruel, entirely disproportionate to any actual harm the choice caused anyone else. What's really happening is that the choice functions as an unintentional challenge to the group's own certainty. If someone can walk away from the expected script and still end up fine, happy, even, it quietly raises an uncomfortable question for everyone who followed the script without ever seriously considering an alternative. Was the path actually necessary, or just familiar? Rather than sit with that question, it's often easier to decide the person who deviated must be wrong, difficult, or lost. This one is worth being honest about, because the discomfort it produces in you is real, even once you understand the mechanism behind it. Knowing that someone's coldness is really about their own unexamined choices doesn't automatically make the coldness painless to receive. What it does is give you a more accurate read on where to direct your energy, not into justifying your choice to people who were never going to be persuaded, but into staying anchored to why you made it in the first place. 9. The lack of recognition. Of all 9, this is the one that shows up most often in ordinary daily life, in relationships that otherwise look perfectly fine from the outside, because it doesn't require conflict. It just requires being consistently, quietly overlooked. I think of a woman who spent years as the person who kept an entire family functioning, remembering birthdays, organizing holidays, being the one everyone called during a crisis, while a sibling who showed up far less consistently got treated, at every family gathering, as the golden child simply for showing up at all. The resentment that built in her wasn't really about wanting more credit for its own sake. It was about the specific, corrosive experience of consistent effort going unnoticed while inconsistent effort got celebrated repeatedly in front of her. What's easy to miss in these situations is how much resentment isn't really about you specifically failing to give recognition. Sometimes it's simply that the other person's need for acknowledgement sits at a different baseline than yours, and what feels like adequate appreciation to you reads as complete invisibility to them. Recognition isn't a fixed, objective amount. It's calibrated differently in every relationship. And assuming your own baseline is universal is one of the quietest ways resentment gets built without either side fully realizing it's happening. The practical takeaway here is less about guarding against becoming a target and more about becoming better, deliberately, at naming what you actually see in the people around you, out loud, specifically, before the gap between effort and acknowledgement has time to calcify into something harder to repair later. Run back through all 9, and a pattern sits underneath every single one. Almost none of this hostility was ever really a verdict on your character. It was envy reflecting someone else's dissatisfaction, a misread text filling in a gap with the worst available story, a values clash exposing a fork someone else didn't take, a rumor nobody checked before repeating, an insecurity that needed somewhere to land, an empathy gap that had nothing to do with you specifically, a rivalry that curdled past what it was ever supposed to be, an expectation you simply didn't meet, or effort that went unseen because someone else's need for recognition was calibrated differently than yours. None of that means you're never wrong, or that every conflict in your life is someone else's malfunction. It means the automatic story, "There's something wrong with me," is usually the least accurate explanation available, and one of the more expensive ones to keep believing by default. Set the boundaries you need to set. Stay honest about your own part, where it's genuinely yours to own. And the rest of it, the cold looks with no clear cause, the distance you can't quite explain, let it belong to whoever's actually carrying it, instead of carrying it yourself.